So what I want to do is to kind of introduce you to some sociological ideas, some of which might be familiar to you, some of which may not be familiar to you. This idea of the decivilising process is a term that is developed from the sociology of Norbert Elias. Has anybody heard of Norbert Elias? Some people felt, you guys have bored people to death about this before. But I'll introduce you to some of his ideas. In actual fact, he's better known for his groundbreaking book called The Civilising Process. And I'll explain some of what that means. And I want to put some of the things that are going on in Scotland in context, because I think things are a bit different in Scotland than they are in the rest of the United Kingdom. I don't think there's a generic discourse working uniformly across the United Kingdom. For instance, if anybody's read Owen Jones's book, Chavs, and I think David before me was kind of reflecting some of that, I think there's differences in terms of the denigration of white, working class young people in England that's different from the discourses of white working class young people in Scotland. I think we have to pay attention to national differences. We can't just wish them away. Society in Scotland has developed under its own history, its own trajectory. The Scottish state, the devolved Scottish state, marks a distinction between Scotland and the British state. Scotland has its own media, semi-autonomous media, broadcast media, print media. And the discourses in popular culture in Scotland are slightly different. And I want to point out some of the ways in which they're different. Okay, so I want to say we have to pay attention to the national context under which these discourses about class and youth actually operate. So we can't have a uniform, universal theory about it. The first thing is that we're always hearing that class is actually a dead category, or as somebody has called it fairly recently, one sociologist whose name I won't repeat, it's a zombie category. In other words, it's a category, class. People don't see themselves in terms of class any longer. Therefore, class has fell into disuse. It's a kind of empty signifier. It doesn't really signify anything. This is why they're calling it a zombie category. It's still used, it's still wandering about, but it's dead, really. Class is dead. Class is finished, there's no future in it. And therefore, class doesn't really seem to refer to anything specific. So it refers to everything. It refers to economic relationships, people going to get employment, the relationship with their line managers, that's a class relationship, the relationship in the market. But it also, and increasingly in sociology, refers to cultural practices. And class, in fact, is more often talked about in terms of cultural practices than it is talked about in terms of employment relations, in the way class used to be thought about. So there's a confusion over what class actually refers to. And in Owen Jones's book, which I would, urge everybody who's not read it to read it. It's a great journalistic book, but it falls a bit short in terms of the specific character of what class is. So, for instance, the cultural codes of denigration, about which we've heard quite a bit already, where people are made to feel inferior, they're made to feel ashamed. They are made to feel culturally different. These are cultural codes rather than specific economic relationships. Cultural codes of denigration. And here's the kind of nub of the matter. So when we talk about chav, I know Owen Jones talks about chavs in his book, and many other sociologists who have been doing this work, they assume it's the same thing as NEDs. So people heard of NEDs? Right. Heard of NEDs? Right, you know what an ED is? Could you define an ED? A tartan chav. What are you pointing at him for? Of course, Neds are often defined by their terrible behaviour, the way they speak, with these terrible accents they've got, barely comprehensible, the clothes they wear. Somebody mentioned tracksuits earlier, training shoes, Burberry, imitation Burberry and so on. And they are ridiculed, aren't they? And that's the way we kind of think about them. And so therefore, they're the Scottish equivalent of the chav in England. We heard about Shannon Matthews, other people who are defined negatively as chavs. That discourse doesn't actually, when you analyse it, when you look at it historically, doesn't play out in the same way in Scotland. So there is a difference at work in the Scottish context. And the way I've tried to approach this is to build on the work of Norbert Elias, the sociologist I mentioned. In his book, he done a study in Leicester in the 1960s, produced a book called The Established and the Outsiders. And the point about the book is he's looking at basically people who are identical in every single respect. And yet one group of people are seen as inferior, and the other group are seen as superior, socially superior. The established group see themselves as superior, and the outsiders are seen as inferior. Why is that interesting? Because we usually think about inferiority as somehow something inherent to people, and people are made to feel inferior because of their gender, because of their sexuality, because of their race, ethnicity, because of their religion, and so on and so forth. But what's important about Elias's study, Norbert Elias in The Established and Outsiders, is these people had no differentiating qualities. They were all working class, they were all white, they were all English, except that one group had recently arrived in the housing estate from London, transferred from London to Leicester at the end of the Second World War, and they were treated as inferior by the people who had already established themselves over a couple of generations. So that's interesting. And what Elias went on to talk about is that in the denigration of the outsiders, the established group would take particularly bad examples and say that's what they're all like. In other words, they would take the minority of the worst, in Elias's phrase. You pick the worst example and you say that's typical of them. This is what they're all like. And you could think about that now in terms of discourses about asylum seekers, immigrants, Muslims, and other minorities. And on the other hand, the established groups contrast this to themselves. They're in a state of social grace, social superiority. And they see themselves as the minority of the best. So they look to the best examples from their own group and say, that's what we're all like. We're all like that. We're all well-behaved, well-mannered, intelligent, clever, sophisticated, and so on. And we get all the good attributes. And these other people, they get all the negative attributes, even though there's no intrinsic difference in the groups. And you can see this in a Scottish case when the sociologist Sean Damer looked at a street in Govan when he did his study in the 1970s. But a street that became known as Wine Alley. Right? Wine Alley in Govan. Simply because of the attributes, the negative attributes that were placed on the people that lived in so-called Wine Alley. Right? Now, what were the attributes? Well, the main attribute and the main problem that made them outsiders was they tended to be Roman Catholic. And Govan tended to be overwhelmingly Protestant. So there was a religious sectarian issue there. And then all sorts of mythologies were spoken about them. That they kept coal in the bath, they were alcoholics, they were wife beaters and so on. You just go through his book and he describes it, you can imagine it. All the worst attributes were given to these people in Wine Alley. The area started to be called Wine Alley. And even the residents of Wine Alley started to talk about themselves in these terms. Oh, it's terrible here. Everybody's like this. It's all out of control. People are on the drink or they're out fighting in the street and so on and so forth. In other words, it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy operates where people play up to the negative attitudes. They play up to these cultural codes of denigration. So it's no accident if you do find youth subcultures exaggerate what the rest of the established groups find distasteful. And this has been borne out, I think, by many studies of different kinds of subcultures. If you think we are bad, then we will be bad. It can be the attitude. Now, Elias develops this kind of analysis in his famous book, The Civilising Process, 2 volumes of it. I'm not asking you to go and seek it out, but just to alert you to the fact that people, kind of heard it earlier on, that society's in crisis, it's all going to the dogs, things are terrible, things are collapsing and decaying around us, when in actual fact, we're living in the most peaceful society that human history has produced. Recorded human history. We're living in a society where people don't expect to be attacked in the street. A man in a tracksuit attacks me when I was going for a taxi, and so on. That is seen to be exceptional and unacceptable. So physical violence has really been drained out of society by and large. The level of crime, violent crime, there is still violent crime, don't get me wrong, but it's on its arse. It's collapsed. Violent crime is in historic decline, generally speaking, over the last couple of 100 years. So what's happened is Elias looks at pre-modern societies, the manners, the customs, the behaviours, the forms of conduct, where people would routinely be violent to each other in these violent societies led by warriors and knights and so on, the nobility. Peasants would expect to meet violence and probably meet an early death at the hands of violence. So we're in a society where this actually doesn't happen. People are living to the ages of 70, 80 and so on, in relative peace. Where is violence gone? Elias argues, along with many sociologists, violence has been concentrated in the state. The state is the place where you will find violence being organised in this form of the criminal justice system, prisons, the police and so on. They're the people that can come and take you away, put you in jail, take your liberties away. It's organised in the military apparatus. They're the people that can organise weaponry and destroy other societies. So violence is increasingly taken out of society and put into the state, leaving greater scope. This leaves greater scope in society for people to have peaceful relationships with each other. Complete strangers in the street, might be different in a broth on a Friday night, but usually complete strangers in the street do not attack each other. So we actually are fortunate in some ways to live in this kind of society. And in the process, people adjust their behaviour and their conduct. And they have learned historically over hundreds of years to control their temper, to control their emotions, right? To put on a good face, to try not to give offence unless they actually mean to give some kind of offence. Yeah? So we live in a kind of society governed by these forms of social relations that Elias sums up by talking about a society of diminishing contrasts and increasing variety. Diminishing contrast, that people in our kind of society see themselves as equals. Whether they are actually equal in terms of material wealth is another matter, but they see themselves as equals. We see ourselves in this society as democratic. We're the equal of any other human being. This is Elias's argument. So we're the equal of Prince Harry. I mean, he's got no special capabilities beyond what we've all got in this room. Yet we don't bow and scrape. We find it difficult to bow and scrape. Our society has been transformed from a society based on a rigid hierarchy to one based on a kind of equality. Not material equality, but a culture of equality. And that's what he means by diminishing contrast. The contrasts between people have diminished and the varieties have increased. There's different ways to be a human being. There's more plurality. There's more different ways to be human in our society than any other society. This is quite different from the usual critical theory that it's all the same and everybody's identical and interchangeable. In fact, there is great freedom for people to take up different kinds of identity. There was a critique earlier about multiculturalism. But that just reflects the fact that people can make collective identity a major feature of their existence. In the past, after the French Revolution, I'll give you this a quick example. After the French Revolution in 1789, the problem was most of the peasants in France didn't know they were French. They had no conception they might be French. They never left within 2 or 3 miles of where they lived and worked and died and passed on to the next generation. So the whole purpose of the French Revolution is they had to make the rest of France outside of Paris into French citizens. This was a challenge for them. Now we live in a world structured where we think about these identities as being Scottish or British or whatever it is, French, Chinese, as part of our second nature. We don't have to really think about it too much. So we've had this controlled decontrolling of emotional life. Yeah, we have put our emotions under control, by and large. But we allow them, we relax them now and again. We relax them sometimes. Where do we relax them? We relax them, for instance, at sporting events. People are allowed to go and shout their head off for 90 minutes at football players. Yeah? We relax them when we go to a pop music festival. We have these spaces that are set aside, special spaces, outside of everyday life, where we can go and relax this tightening up of the emotions, this tightening up of feeling. Now, what does this mean in terms of class? This is what I want to come on to, is that there is a constant tension then between the class divisions that exist in our society, in many ways deepening class divisions, and this relative equalisation of culture, this democratic culture that we inhabit. So there's a tension there between, on the one hand, entrenched divisions of wealth and resources, and on the other hand, this sense that we're the equal of each other. Nobody's got any special merit beyond what every other person might have. So there's this constant tension. And it expresses itself in the relationship between classes. So, middle class people, not everybody, middle class discourses tend to denigrate, tend to look down at working class cultural practices. Right? Yeah. Who doesn't like to go for a drink on a Friday night? I mean, I'm not with Christus on this matter. Who doesn't like to have a controlled decontrolling every now and again? It's the weekend, let's go and have a few pints and then maybe have a few pints too many and suffer all weekend for it. Who doesn't actually need to release the tension sometime? And what it produces is this new frontier in modernity, in modern societies, of shame and disgust. Because there's lots of things we now find reprehensible that was never found reprehensible in the past. And this is what Elias does in the first volume of the Civilising process, which is absolutely brilliant. I would encourage you to read some of that, where he goes through things like spitting, defecating, all these kind of things, bodily functions of various kinds, sexual practices, sleeping, where people sleep. Yeah, people used to not have a special place where they went and done the toilet. Yeah, 500-600 years ago. This is a fairly recent invention in human history. We'll have a special place put aside, a private place, a cubicle, that we'll go to relieve ourselves. And even the language we start to use is a language of euphemisms. We don't say exactly what we're doing. Right? We're going to spend a penny. Or, as the upper classes would say when we're going to bed, we're going to retire for the evening. We talk in these euphemisms increasingly in order to disguise our feeling of disgust and shame at our own bodily feelings and functions. Yeah, so more and more that is put out of sight, and this new threshold of shame and disgust. It's no accident that you get this new threshold of shame and disgust that we're meant to feel. And we feel more or less automatically ever since we're children. Elias gives all these examples of children being trained in table manners, potty training, etc., etc. Yeah? It's no accident that this begins to emerge as the division of labour increases in society As people work in more and more specialised occupations, they begin to depend more and more upon millions of anonymous other people doing something else. We don't produce, we're not self-sufficient producers. So we actually need to go to the supermarket. I mean, again, I have to disagree with Christos. Usually we go to the supermarket, usually we pay, hopefully, for our goods. Somebody else has produced this. Millions of impersonal social relations have occurred in order for us to go and get that ready meal for £2.99 because we can't be bothered cooking because we're knackered and been working all day. So, in other words, society is becoming more and more, people in society are more and more interdependent on each other. And as you become more and more interdependent, you can't just lash out the minute you have a bad mood. You can't just lose your temper. You can't just attack somebody because you don't like the look of them. By and large, I'm not saying there's not some people who do this, but by and large, I think it was David gave the example of somebody getting punched at a cash line machine. These things happen, but by and large, it's shocking to us. It's not what we expect. In societies in the Middle Ages, that wouldn't have been shocking. Well, a cash line machine might have been shocking in the Middle Ages, but getting punched in the face probably wouldn't have. And therefore, one of the biggest issues in modern societies is the feeling of self-loathing that comes to all of us when we're in the presence of people who are socially superior. I don't mean they are actually superior, but they have higher social standing, and they sometimes effortlessly make us feel inferior. And we feel ourselves getting red in the face. And we feel our accent is a disgrace. And we feel ashamed of ourselves, our bodily shape, our persona, our clothing, our lack of same qualifications, our lack of knowledge about the finer things in life, fine wines and arts and literature and so on. Yes, that these people automatically know everything about. They seem to. Yeah. So there's this feeling of shame and loathing that comes with this change in the class relationships. Yeah, so we always want to protect ourselves to avoid feelings of social disgrace. The worst thing that can happen is for you and your group to be labelled as disgraceful. That's the worst thing, when you can be labelled on the back of the minority of the worst. So somebody who wears a tracksuit punches somebody at a cash line machine, and everybody that wears tracksuits and Burberry caps and so on, they're all like that. So we feel this social disgrace, and where this has been relaxed to some extent since the 1960s, 1950s, since Elvis Presley shook his hips and caused outrage, where it's been more relaxed over the last 30 or 40 years, Elias and others working in this tradition tend to explain it is because people have so much control over what they're doing, is that men and women can be in the same room together now. It's true. It's happening before our eyes. Yeah, right. The clothing doesn't need to cover the whole of the woman's body any longer. That even professional workers don't always need to wear a suit and a shirt and a tie. And some people grow their hair long, and some people get their hair short, and some people have spiky hair, and some people wear pointed shoes, and people are a bit more relaxed about it. And we can gradually see the decline in things like homophobia. It's still there, don't get me wrong, it's still there. Gradually we see the decline in things like racism, things that are unacceptable now that probably you would have got away with 20 or 30 years ago. So things have become increasingly relaxed only because people are increasingly keeping things under control. How does it work? It works partly through class. I want to kind of move on rapidly. That class is not a zombie category, as many sociologists believe. And I don't know if you've had a look at the Great British Class Survey at the BBC. I would advise you to have a look. I'll give you some examples from it in a second. But they essentially went back to Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist's model of class, based on three components: cultural capital, social capital, and economic capital. Cultural capital, it simply means the ability that individuals have within groups to behave knowledgeably competently in matters of high culture, right? That you don't listen to TFM, but you listen to Radio 3, yeah? That you don't watch these trashy soap operas, but you get box sets of, I don't know, Deadwood or Breaking Bad or whatever the latest tasteful product is, yeah? That you don't watch these chat shows and confessionals and so on, but you watch serious interviews by Jeremy Paxman or whatever. So that's the kind of level of cultural capital. People are able to demonstrate through their own bodily behaviour that they're superior in some ways, culturally superior. Social capital refers to the networks that people have. How well connected are they? How extensive are your networks? And people's social capital allows them to get advantages, particularly in the marketplace, particularly in the market for labour. Yeah? So people can use their social capital. They went to public school together, then they went to Oxford and Cambridge together, and then they all get jobs in the city together, and then we have your 3 generations of stockbrokers. And the next thing, they're saying, we're all in it together, and telling us to suffer. And finally, economic capital. And it's economic capital that used to be the decisive category when talking about class. People either had ownership of the means of production, as the Marxists would say, or they didn't, and they were forced to sell their labour. And that is essentially what traditionally defined class. That is traditionally what defined class. But that's kind of been subordinated and dropped, even in this the Great British Class Survey. They've really focused excessively, in some ways, on cultural capital. And culture has eclipsed economics, which is bizarre in the middle of a crisis, when people's wages are not keeping pace with prices and so on, when house prices are out of control. And they come up with these classes. I think there's 7 classes, is it? Let me go through it. But in British society, the elite, the most privileged class, they have high levels of capital. The established middle classes, they have lower economic capital, but they have high economic capital, but less cultural and social capital. And then there's this increasingly important new affluent worker category. That's people who've been to university, went into the professions, and they have not a lot of economic capital, but really high cultural and social capital. Right? They've had an education at an advanced level. They know quite a lot about culture. They know how to behave themselves. They know how to use their knife and fork and so on. You know, really smart people. And then there's the emergent service workers, essentially the people who are doing routine forms of service work in sales and retail and whatever. And then there's a traditional working class, the class that's in decline. It's in decline everywhere. Basically, the traditional industrial manual working class, people who worked in factories, assembly lines and so on. We see the problem a couple of weeks ago at Grangemouth in Scotland. That was representative of it. And just the other day, in terms of the shipbuilding industry in Scotland and England, of course. And that is a class that's in decline. It's been in long-term decline. And then there's this new class as well at the very bottom that they are calling the precariat. A precarious group, a group of people who live in an insecure situation, living on their wits in many ways, dealing in the twilight economy. Right? Do you want something? A nice bit of Burberry? See if I can get you, my man. Right? You know, or sometimes semi-criminal conduct, right? Concealed from the wider public and the economy. And of course, these are the most deprived, most insecure class. They have low levels of every kind of capital. Low economic capital, they're living in poverty. They have low cultural capital, low levels of education, and low social capital. They just know their neighbours and their family and each other. Right, so that gives us a kind of snapshot. It gives us a picture at one level of these new terms that are being used to talk about class in Britain. Something that Owen Jones, as I say, has looked at when he says, right at the start of his book, that the working class, which used to be seen as the salt of the earth, These were the people that were grounded, that kept it together and so on. Yeah, didn't get above themselves. Are now treated as the scum of the earth. Now, that's very interesting, the Shannon Matthews case and Jade Goody and so on. Working class people are seen as the scum of the earth, as opposed to being the heroic proletariat of the past, the coal miners, steel workers, and so on. And there's a kind of problem with that, because we're not talking actually about the same kind of people. But Owen Jones is mainly talking about the groups of people that would fall into the category precariat, which is not quite the same as the people who used to be seen as the salt of the earth, the Fife coal miners, the jute workers in Dundee, the fishing workers in Arbroath. And what it does, though, what he argues, is that middle class has now become the norm, and everything is measured against middle class values, tastes, and culture. Yeah, middle class, so you have to be aspirational. You have to be trying to advance yourself. You have to be tasteful. You have to show taste. Yeah, you have to show knowledge of tasteful things, whether it's food, whether it's literature, whether it's music, whether it's films. You have to be able to hold a conversation with these middle-class people, right, about DVD box sets that they enjoy. What it said in The Guardian last week about something that's happening somewhere far away in the world. Whereas the working class is increasingly defined not by the kind of work people do, but by their deviant lifestyles, their disgraceful lifestyles, and their cultural vulgarity. These people walking about in tracksuits, Burberry caps, and so on. It's quite funny, because I was at St Andrews the other day there. Not many Burberry caps in sight, but some of the zany clothing this is the upper class students in St Andrews wearing yellow corduroys and thinking it's pretty cool. But I was the only person in the street pointing at them. I was. They were looking at me with my tracksuit on. So there's seen to be a central role played, and we heard, I won't repeat it all, about the central role, and you heard maybe Greg earlier on talking about it, of the media in cultural constructions of class inferiority. And that is certainly can be evidenced. There's been lots of work done on it, to show the way in which these people are not like us. And we know all the shows, and I'll touch on some of them. You've already had this, so I won't go on about it. The minority of the worst. Comedic caricatures. People we can point at, go, look how ridiculous they are. Wayne and Wynette are slob, the Harry Enfield characters, Vicky Pollard, and the Lauren Cooper, Catherine Tate, Am I Bothered character, right? Even Tony Blair had to get in the act there. I don't know if people can remember this. Am I Bothered, he started, because he's really cool as well. So passing over that, the Scottish versions of that don't actually fit, is the kind of thing I'm going to say. There is no real equivalent in Scotland to these caricatures. These chav caricatures don't actually fit, and I'll come on to it. And we can have a discussion if you think otherwise. The minority of the worst is reality television. Again, I won't go into it all. Jeremy Kyle and Wife Swap and Jane Goody we've mentioned. And finally, the news. This is all my talk's already been covered. The news, Shannon Matthews, the disappearance in the year 200. Did anybody notice that? Yeah, in the year 200. Not literally, in the year 200. And the implicit contrast with the McCann family, that's already been touched on. Carol Malone, writing in the News of the World, said about them, they represent, this is the minority of the worst. You take these distressful episodes that are so exceptional and unusual, and then you try and talk about them, and the media try to talk about them as if they're typical. Malone says they're a subhuman class. They're not. This is language, by the way, that leads to dangerous situations. When you start talking about people as subhuman, as Carol Malone, I don't like her much, but I still consider her a human being. A subhuman class that now exists in the murkiest, darkest corners of this country. And again, I won't elaborate, given what we heard earlier. And we must end the something for nothing culture. Recently repeated in Scotland, of course, by the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland. We must end the something for nothing culture. Such an easy cliche that runs off the tongue. And I think we've all went through that. I just want to point out that this is a rhetoric about undeserving people. They're getting something for nothing. They're lying about in their beds when the rest of us are having to get out and work. Yeah, when we're having to, and for our students, trying to study as well as trying to work and trying to bring up children and doing all of these things amazingly. And then there's these people who do absolutely nothing except screw the system. And then they get annoyed by it. And the Daily Express says, you're quite right to be annoyed. And by the way, while you're being annoyed by us, look at the Muslims. We can have a category that catches all these minorities of the worst. It came through in the London riots and the Philpott murder, that terrible case, where the children were, the house was set on fire. I think so as they could get another council house at the time. Right, now there are exceptions to this, isn't there? If anybody's seen Ken Loach's film, Ken Loach, the great director of films mainly about working class lives, Spirit of 45, and he's trying to say this is when the working class were the salt of the earth, when the working class movement built the welfare state, demanded the welfare state during and at the end of the Second World War. But if you look at the film, he's been really nostalgic for a class that doesn't exist, for the industrial working class in the coal mines, when in the industries that became nationalised, in the shipyards, when hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of workers could combine in trade unions and really make their power felt. Really make their power felt. And we saw what's happened this week and a couple of weeks ago at Grangemouth, what happened this week at Govan, were examples of the weakness of even the trade union movement. So it's okay looking back to it, and isn't it great what was achieved? The National Health Service, social insurance, social security, comprehensive education, and housing. Mass campaign of house building to take people out of slums. These houses that are now considered housing schemes at the time were seen as a real step forward, as real progress. That is gone. Right, I want to kind of finish up now, coming back to the problem of nation and class. Ken Loach is really talking about the British welfare state, the British working class movement. Yeah, this is what he's really getting at. And much of the more recent discussion about the minority of the worst really concerns these chav caricatures that apply in a very vitriolic and venomous way in England, in a way in which maybe they don't quite have the same resonance in Scotland. I'm trying to say they're a bit more ambiguous in Scotland. There's a different cultural trajectory in Scotland. There was mass levels of poverty in Scotland. We heard something earlier about maybe Scotland's got a slightly more, you can argue about this, democratic mentality, a democratic intellect. Right. Jokes aren't that funny. You all right? And the NED, even recent research into NEDs, so-called NEDs, if we can use that term, has found that even in Glasgow, and research that was done in schools in Glasgow, found that even some middle class kids wanted to identify themselves as NEDs, just so as they can stick it to the man, to the authorities, to their parents and so on. Yeah, they want to adopt the swagger. Just the exact same way as you get white middle class kids in America trying to pretend they're gangster rappers. The Beastie Boys and so on. So the representations in Scotland are a wee bit more ambiguous if you think about representations of working class in novels, in film, in literature. Yeah, I'm thinking about Peter Millen's film just a couple of years ago called Neds. It was kind of it was sympathetic. It was showing cultural solidarity with the most oppressed groups in society. If you read Irvine Welsh's short story, The Kingdom of Fife, which I would urge everybody to read, No matter what you think of Fife. It's set in a lovely little village called Cowdenbeath. And after the miners' strike, how can you be a working class man when that a way of constructing masculinity is gone? Yeah, so it's a real funny, interesting story, typical Irving Welsh stuff. Irving Welsh's novels all can repeatedly show solidarity with the people in the most marginalised positions in society. And he's always having a pop at the people in authority. So we have different representations. And Chewing the Fat. Right? Who doesn't love Chewing the Fat? Chewing the Fat. Right? And they have their own Ned caricatures, don't they? In Chewing the Fat. But they're treated much more sympathetically. Aye, they're a bit ridiculous, but they're not any more ridiculous than other people in our society. They're not especially ridiculous. Yeah, they just have their own way of talking, their own way of walking, as they say in the song, when you're in with the in crowd. And that's how it's treated. It's treated in a kind of more humorous rather than judgmental form of discourse. I've just, I don't know why I put that slide up there, but that was just to show you how in Scottish newspapers we analysed how Ned was never mentioned in newspapers. Until when? Until after devolution. There might be a relationship there that needs explained, which I can't quite explain, but there's some kind of connection between the rise in discussion in Scottish newspapers. We looked at the national newspapers, Daily Records, Scotsman, Scotsperson, Herald, and so on. And we looked at these across all these years, and this is what we found, that the discourse about Neds takes off as we approach after devolution, and then it kind of tapers away. Remember, there was a campaign in the Scottish Parliament, you might not remember, many years ago, when there was socialists in the Scottish Parliament, to ban the word Neds because it was denigrating and so on. So that kind of tapers on and it's kind of wavering, but it's there in the culture. And people in newspapers use it, journalists in newspapers use it, often in sympathetic ways, not necessarily to condemn. And that's a difference. Where we have found the culture of denigration is in this Ned genre of books, which I won't go into. Joke books, quite funny at one level, but I think the point was made well earlier on by David. Change Ned to black, Jewish, lesbian, or any other ridiculed denominator, and the whole thing would become illegal. In fact, and you could argue, some people have argued, Owen Jones argues it, the last people that you can attack with impunity are the people least able to defend themselves at the lower sections of the working class. Right, now, having said all that, don't have any big kind of message at the end. I have a few questions. That class is now not to do with economic position people are in, but it seems to be much more to do with cultural status. Are you wearing the right clothes? Can you talk the talk? And so on. Are media representations of working class, here we're often talking about the precariat at the bottom end of the class system, uniformly negative? And I'm trying to say, well, things are a bit more complicated, certainly in the terms of the Scottish representations. Does it depend on genre and format? In other words, if it's a comedy, or if it's the news, or current affairs or something. Does that then change how we understand representations of working class young people? And how do the cultural codes work for different audiences? So in Scotland, we might have a different attitude to this. Maybe working class people themselves. I think it was David again, you made all my points for me. That even when people leave the working class in Scotland and enter the middle classes, they don't tend to try and stamp down on the people below them. They still, why are there no Tories? And why is the support for Conservatives in Scotland so small when the middle class in Scotland is as big as it is in England? So there's maybe a different kind of cultural politics going on there. And we have to pull out the similarities and differences between the representations of chavs, which has been done to death in many ways, and stop conflating it as if it was all the same thing across national space with Neds. And finally, touching on something that Christos was dealing with, in a situation of crisis, when people are flailing around for people to blame. And it's very easy to blame the dispossessed. There is a danger that society tips into a decivilising process. I don't think we can afford to be too complacent, even in Bonnie Jockland. I don't think we can afford to be too complacent about it, that it can spiral against people's real intentions into a culture of denigration. It can spiral. The chaff thing came really out quite quickly out of nowhere. I think, as was said, invented by a couple of upper-class clowns. They are literally clowns, but we can also use clowns in other ways. Yep. So therefore, the ideological significance of this discourse can have a different resonance in different situations. In a situation of more or less permanent crisis that we were hearing about earlier on, the representations of the working class in Scotland, as elsewhere, can lead to decivilising responses. And if that filters through to society, there's a danger in all these things in escalating cycles of violence. Where violence has been in long-term decline, it can return. And that was shown in the 1930s in Europe. Street violence can return, which translates into political violence. We've seen the Scottish Defence League, other neo-fascist organisations trying to use the dispossessed as an instrument for Islamophobia, to generate resentment against another relatively dispossessed part of society. So that's just a few questions that I would kind of leave it with. And if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them and say I don't really know the answers. Just for the long day, people are looking exhausted. It's hot in here. MD? You've been awfully well behaved.
I just wanted to ask, you talk about how for a very long time, historically speaking, we lived in a very rigid society, and it's only until fairly recently that we lived in the more lucid sort of class. People enter in and out of different classes all the time, and there's even more different groups of class now. It isn't just upper, middle, or lower now, like you said, there's all stuff like that. The question I wanted to ask you is the sort of sense of equality and self-control that we're living in now. Is it simply a phase that society, all the world is going through, or is it now more than ever, than any time in human history, are we changing for the better? And is this sort of self-controlling, self-shaming going to actually stick for the future? Or like I said, or is this just simply going to be a phase and we're going to regress back into the old very rigid society, as we've seen in the previous talk about crisis and how crisis affects society, and we just break down and we regress back to old, very draconian sort of attitudes towards minority groups?
Did everybody hear that? That was an excellent question. Does anybody want to answer it? That's a brilliant question. I mean, that is the fundamental question. I would respond if people want to chip in, because it raises all the core issues. The civilising process in Europe has been underway for 1,000 years. It's been 1,000 years where the automatic resort to violence has been eroded. So if you like, the self-constraint that people operate under is automatic to them. It's second nature. And it's extremely difficult to break out of that self-constraint because we've inherited it now for generations across hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, you take the worst example in Elias. Elias was a German Jew. His mother was killed in Auschwitz. He wrote the civilising process to explain what was happening, even though he doesn't talk about the contemporary events. He's trying to understand how it is that could go in reverse. How can that go in reverse so quickly? And here we have in Germany, in the 1930s, the most sophisticated culture in Europe, the most relaxed social norms, people experimenting with all sorts of lifestyles in Berlin, which is the most important city, in culturally speaking, in Europe at the time. Jews, by and large, don't even see themselves as Jews hardly, are assimilated into that culture. Yeah? And it was reversed in the matter of a year or two after the 1929 stock market crash caused utter chaos. So while it's built in, it can be reversed, and it can be reversed very quickly. The point is that even in Nazi Germany, they had to conceal the extent of their atrocities and crimes because it would have turned the stomach of most Germans. As research shows us. No, it's not the case that Germans were demanding the annihilation of the Jews. Certainly a fanatical group among them were, a tiny group actually. And it's that point that so deeply built in was this civilizing constraint that even the Nazis, in the height of their atrocities, had to keep it hidden. That's why they built the concentration camps far away from urban centres and so on. And they kept it a closely guarded secret, put criminals in charge of it, and lunatics and sadists and so on. Not ordinary Germans. So it can change, but Elias's argument is we're on a trajectory in these kind of cultures that is very hard to break down. So when we confront, if anybody has experienced violence, don't you find it utterly shocking? Isn't it when you encounter violence in this casual violence anywhere, a shock? We are not like people in the Middle Ages where we expect to encounter it. If we're travelling along a road at night on our own, we expect to be attacked. You have to take precautions and so on, get ready to fight back. We travel along the roads and we don't expect to be attacked. We still take precautions in certain areas of town and so on. But really, we don't expect that to happen. So this is the fundamental point, that we, as sociologists, are not prophets. So we can't say this will all break down. The crisis will mean the logic of this alienation and so on will cause all this disaster. It may well happen, the rise of fascism in Greece at the moment, but that's being rolled back to some extent because people cannot stomach the murder that is happening. The people know the history of what's happened recently in Greece. It's turning people to revulsion against the fascists in Greece because of the violent nature. So I don't know if that satisfies you as a kind of answer. Any thoughts on it? Are we all civilised now?
Or are we simply just faking?
If it's automatic, it's difficult to fake.
And of course, you've got to take into account, people who change, who come from that society of violence, and people who are simply who grew up in a society of non-violence. But we've seen that people who grew up in a society of non-violence sometimes tend to go towards, who tend to revert back into violence. Not all the time, but most commonly. I mean, you look at the London riots, for example. It wasn't entirely. A majority was very poor, working class sort of people that did partake, particularly very young people as well, that partook in riots. But there were very few, some very, say, upper class that partook in some of the rioting. But what I'm trying to say is that. What was I trying to say? I'm just waffling. No, what I'm trying to say is that although we say that we live in a society that's about self-control, if you actually looked at the inner workings, because we say we live in a society of self-control, if we did so, then how come London riots happened? I mean, I would argue that, well, the people that participated in it didn't live in the so-called self-controlling society we live in, because they were the very ones that have been cut off and corralled into small segments of society which do not certainly approve of, but expect on a daily occurrence violence and criminal behaviour. And of course, when that bounces back into the so-called self-controlled society, they get demonised, and you create this huge division of people.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the gang culture and so on, and but even there are kind of controls. And the point you would really need to ask is, why is there not rioting every day? Why are people not automatically going out and saying, I'm collectively, we're all fed up with this. Let's riot every day, smash things up every day. The London riots was a kind of exceptional situation that emerged. It might happen again. Don't get me wrong. It happened in the 1980s. The riots in Brixton and the riots in Toxteth and these against police brutality. So these can break out quickly, but they tend to die out quickly as well. So the London riots did not last. They burnt themselves out. And this is the part of the problem is, why is violence not more endemic? So why do we focus on the exceptions rather than the routine? Why don't we focus on the ordinary, that most people most of the time are under self-restraint, but within that self-restraint they can relax and loosen up, they can decontrol, if you like, decontrol the controls. Yeah. And this is the...
Perhaps focus on that happening to take away from the bigger picture of what the problems in our society are.
Yes, I mean, for some people the riots was utterly shocking. Other people expected it to happen, and they would say, why is this not happening more often, given the conditions people are suffering under? So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a kind of situation of manipulation, but we can expect to see explosions. So Glasgow has got some of the most entrenched gang culture in Western Europe. You heard of Glasgow? Centre of civilization, about 80 miles away. Right, it's honestly, it's good. Gangs go back a long way in Glasgow. And yet, there was no rioting in Glasgow. Because they're too busy rioting every weekend. Honestly, there was no rioting. There was no attempt to go into the city centre. And no serious attempt to, If levels of gangs, if levels of that kind of brutality that young working class men in particular inflict on each other, if it was going to automatically be expressed, then you would have thought Glasgow was this is certainly going to happen in Glasgow. Right? And in fact, where do we find it happens in some English towns that nobody's ever heard of before?
Do you think that politically and economically we're going back in class, if you know what I mean, going back to upper class, middle class and lower class when it comes politics and stuff? I know that maybe personally we've got different groups of classes chavs and different things like that, but do you not think because the politicians and they're all setting up in the higher class and we've got the working class and obviously the people that are on benefits and I think we're kind of reverting back a bit,
I'd be interested to hear what people think, but I can see that politicians are a professional class to themselves. They all come from the same social group, by and large. It used to be in the past some working class people would become Labour MPs because they'd been involved in trade unions and so on, but not now. They all need to have went to Oxford or Cambridge or the London School of Economics. They all have some kind of wealth in their background, not all of them, most of them. Yeah. So I think the politicians less and less reflect the generality of society. And it's not... maybe in Scotland we have a slightly different set of politicians. Maybe. I'm not saying they're great or anything, far from it. Most of them did go to university. Most of them are professional politicians. And this is maybe where the disconnection comes in. But yes, I think myself, class is an economic condition, first of all, and it's these other things that reinforce it in different ways. Cultural capital and social capital reinforce economic capital disadvantages. And it's clear that British society is splitting into two major classes.
And so do you think that maybe the lower, the unemployed and that, maybe you're looking up at the politicians and thinking, oh, they've got this, they've got that, and they're stealing off us, and I think that's why they're maybe not taking interest in politics, because they feel they can't do anything about it.
Yes, no, exactly. And Christos talked about apathy, and there's a good reason why people feel apathetic. Say, well, what's that got to do with us? As Ken Livingstone, the Labour MP, used to say, if voting changed anything, they'd abolish it. That's not, that's a bit cynical, but, people feel disengaged from the whole culture of it. What does it take? A celebrity to come back and say, "Oh, let's get involved in this with Russell Brand," and this could be exciting. It's a struggle for political culture and consciousness. Is that what it takes?
Well, that's a representative, isn't it? He is actually representative as opposed to a politician who is no longer representative.
Sure.
Whatever he was saying,
Well,
there were
maybe not
dangerous
all.
elements to what he was saying, but I think people, certainly young people, find it far easier to relate to what he's saying and hear him say it. It's coming from a more genuine place, a less privileged place. He was scrutinised or criticised for being a hypocrite, but when he was poor, he was saying exactly the same. And then I think he was accused of something, I can't remember if it was apathy or whatever he was accused of when he was poor, but it's easier to listen to it come from somebody like that.
But isn't it interesting the way in which resistance is not coming through the social movements who are trying to protect welfare, defend council housing campaigns, defend the National Health Service and so on. All of these campaigns, defend the disabled, all of these grassroots campaigns, but yet they are being marginalised. And so where is the kind of resistance coming from? So maybe in our society, all societies have always needed leaders to head up movements. They have. This is the fact of it. The socialist movement needed leaders. It had leaders, usually middle-class intellectuals. Russell Brand is maybe a bit looking for a different kind of...
Yes, he's probably thinks that, actually, quite honestly. With social mobility and so on, and he's very eloquent. He's more representative of a middle class than a working class.
He knows, he's read his Guardian.
Yeah,